Good afternoon. Now, today we're going to talk about writing the claim. Now, writing the claim, these are supporting paragraphs and sometimes supporting premises as well. Okay, so when you're writing an analysis of an argument that you're reading, for example, or you have read, or you listened to, or you've seen, there are two major options that you have. You can choose to make a factual, non-judgmental statement about the argument, or you can evaluate it. So, for example, if we were to examine the most recent McDonald's commercial, for example, okay, if you were to do something like that, if you were to write an essay explaining the tactics that were needed to persuade consumers to eat at McDonald's or try McDonald's newer sandwich, you would be supporting or making a supporting factual claim or a claim of fact because it's based on a fact. If you were to write the ads about the ad's effectiveness in attracting adult consumers, you would be supporting and evaluating the claim of value. Okay, so there are two different kinds of claims that you can be making here. I hope that, so the first one, okay, in the first one where we're evaluating or trying to persuade the consumer, we're talking about facts. In the second one, we're talking about the act, not necessarily in the first one you're talking about persuading somebody to try a sandwich, and so you're talking about the tactics. In the second one, you're talking about the effectiveness, which is sort of the result. Okay, so it's the difference between explaining the use of the talking gecko and the gecko ads and praising the marketing decision. Okay, so for example, if you're explaining the use, then you would probably be making a claim of fact, and the marketing decision itself would be a little bit different. So now a third type that we sometimes talk about of claim after the third type of claim after value and fact is a claim of policy. Now this is a kind of claim of that's more future oriented, and it's rare to have this in a thesis that would that you're talking about. A claim of policy would be an analyzing an argument would be to rate or to have a thesis that would should or should not have been done. Okay, in your thesis statement, you're going to talk about value or fact one way or the other. But claims of policy are usually future oriented. They don't look back and express what should have been done. They don't. They look forward to what should be done in the future. Example, one might write an essay about what McDonald's should do in its future ads, okay? Whereas prior to this, when we're talking about fact or evaluating fact or evaluation, you're talking about the difference between what's going on in the commercial itself, or what's the value of overall attracting consumers to support such things. So it's a little different, okay, for each one. Now, sorry about that. Praising. So, okay, we talked about that. I'm sorry, I gotta make sure I'm in the right place. So, think about a claim of fact and claims of value that might serve as a thesis statement about arguments, okay? For example, we could draw two famous arguments. We could draw on two famous arguments that occur about Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the subject of Charles Adams' essay, Lincoln's Logic, which support a claim of value. Okay. In Adams, he's saying Lincoln's address did not fit the world of his day. It reflected his logic, which was based on a number of errors and falsehoods. Okay. This is what Adams said. All right. He actually, I believe, heard it. So Adams was talking about a claim of value. An objective analyst of the speech based on a claim that might explain the orientation of the context of the time or Lincoln's use of poetic language. Okay. In your work, consider how your thesis looks different when you make a statement about a document when you are making a judgment. So in other words, when you are using these claims, when you're making a claim of something, are you make sure you're making a claim of fact based on the facts or whatever you're linking, or are you making a value judgment? See, that's where we're going. So a claim of fact, for example, the Declaration of Independence bases its claims on the kinds of support. Factual evidence appeals to the values of its audience. There's a logical argument and a pattern. The Declaration of Independence is largely deductive in its reasoning. Okay. A claim of value would be to say, okay, is to evaluate the Declaration of Independence itself. Jefferson's argument is clear. It has a formal prose, remains a masterpiece of English prose, persuades us that we are reading something that's important. The document's impact is its lessons for modern readers because several significant terms are not defined, okay? But it's still there as a claim of value. So in these examples, based on the Gettysburg Address and the Declaration of Independence, we are looking at one document at a time, and then a single argument as well. Okay, so at times you'll want to compare things. You'll want to compare two or more arguments and synthesize their ideas. Two basic types of theses that you might want to choose is choose to support. For example, those that objectively analyze the points of comparison or contrast the two, and those that evaluate the two relationships to each other. So if you wrote claims about how they compare, they might look like this. Okay, so you have those that analyze the points, and then you have those that evaluate the two relationships with each other. Okay, so where Jefferson based his argument principally on the logic of appeal, Lincoln depended primarily on emotion and on emotional appearance. So again, claim of fact, Jefferson based his argument principally on logic. Lincoln depended primarily on the emotion of the day, which is actually true, Another one, because Lincoln's purpose was to dedicate a cemetery, he left implicit most of his references to the political situation that was on the minds of those who were listening. Because Jefferson knew he was justifying rebellion from King George III, but also for the future, he spelled out explicitly why the colonies were breaking with England. Okay, two different issues. Okay, so when we're looking at these things, these claims, you have to be careful. So they might look like this. These are claims of fact, okay? And we could, and to justify these things, we could look at the document. Lincoln depended primarily on emotional appearance. We could look at that. We could do some studying. All right. Now, claims of value. You could do some comparison here. All right. So, Lincoln's Address is a period piece. It recalls a darker chapter in American history. But Jefferson's Declaration was has much greater impact as an inspiration for others to reform other reform movements worldwide. And you could make basis on you could make an argument based on these differences and comparisons as well. Lincoln's Address really is more about an American history than it is about than Jefferson is making his declaration is much more magnanimous. The difference, as the two historical documents are, both the Gettysburg Address and the Declaration of Independence are effective in achieving their respective purposes. Okay, the Jefferson's is announcing to the world that we are independent. Lincoln really is talking more about a specific event, whereas you could see how the two are different. Okay, if you were to compare the two. So when you're planning, as you're planning the structure, okay, when you propose in writing an argument to analyze, is to support a factual claim, you will use defending the main idea notions. Okay. In all forms of organization, you need to defend your main idea, your claim with support in this case, and the support will come from the arguments you are writing about. Okay? So, for example, your claim may set up an easy organization for your essay. For example, the Declaration of Independence bases its claim on two kinds of support: factual evidence and appeals of value to its audience. The body of the essay will be the thesis, would most likely have two main divisions. One about factual evidence, okay, providing examples, and another about appeals to values, also providing evidence. So you've kind of already established, in other words, you've already established a structure in and of itself as well. The other thesis about the Declaration of Independence doesn't suggest such an obvious structure. An essay based on that thesis would need to explain how the Declaration of Independence is an example of deductive reasoning, most likely by first establishing what generalizations the document is based on, and what specifics Jefferson uses to prove the colonist situation fits that generalization. So you would want to, in a thesis like that, you would want to be more specific. But what you have to remember is that when you're comparing or contrasting two arguments, there will be two basic patterns to choose from that you can look at. Okay. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I want to make sure I'm in the right spot. Some patterns. When you're doing a comparing or a contrast in your arguments, there will be two basic patterns. One is called the point-by-point comparison, discussing pointing out subject subject B before moving to the second points. Okay, this is kind of the pattern what you would have. Okay, so if you're making a point-by-point comparison, you would, for example, let's say there are three areas that you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about the point, how each uses context, how each uses explicitness, and how each uses language. So you would thereby, in a point-by-point pattern, you would, for example, talk about context, and in that context you would talk about the context of the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson had, and then you would talk about Lincoln's context. Jefferson's context is more about the time of the just before the American Revolution. Lincoln is talking about a civil war, two different contextual situations, okay? Implicitness and explicitness. You would talk about the implicit ideas that Jefferson had and explicitness that he talks about. And then you would also mention Lincoln, his implicitness and explicitness, okay? And then you would move on to the third point, which is about language. What kind of language does Jefferson use? His language is more direct. His language is more specific. He accuses the king explicitly and says, he has done this. Boom, 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 boom. And then you would look at the implicit and explicit points that Lincoln talks about. Okay, what is implied in some of the language that Jefferson uses, that Lincoln uses? 7 years ago, our fathers. When he says 7, he's not talking about the founding fathers of the Constitution. He's going back further and talking about the idea of freedom that was brought about the Declaration of Independence. So there's an implicitness and explicitness there. And what kind of language is used? Jefferson is talking as being more direct. Jefferson is being more formal. Is Lincoln really being formal here? He's opening a cemetery, he's making different type of situation. So, and then you make a conclusion about the three different areas. So this is what we call a point-by-point pattern when we're talking about facts and so forth. The next pattern is more of a parallel, where you have a subject and then another subject, half of the subject. And so the points are made in each half and then should be presented in the same order. So in other words, if you do a point-by-point comparison, or if you do a parallel comparison like we're talking here, you're going to talk about the one entire subject, and then you're going to talk about the other entire subject. So if you were to look at the comparing and contrasting these three particular points, first you're going to talk about Jefferson and talk about the three points that he has, three areas, and then you would talk about Lincoln. And note the difference here. You've divided each section in two. You're talking about Jefferson as talking about his entire manner, and then you would talk about Lincoln's entire manner, and then you would make a conclusion as to what the differences are. So it's a little bit different than the point-by-point. In the point-by-point, you're going to say, okay, they both talk about context, Jefferson, Lincoln. It's different in the parallel because you are taking the whole thing together. Okay. How do you provide support? Well, you're certainly going to need to understand the argument and make it clear to your readers what you're doing. Okay, are you making a point-by-point comparison, or are you making a parallel comparison? And it's hard to make a clear explanation or a fair evaluation if you don't know what the subject is, and if you don't know what if you don't tell your reader what you're doing. And you'll need to look closely at each piece and recall what specific words or ideas that led you to the idea and the path that you chose to support. Okay, so support will come from the text or text you're writing about in the form of summaries and paraphrases and quotations. So if you're making, if you're supporting, you're getting that support from the Declaration itself and from the Gettysburg Address itself. So the ability to summarize and paraphrase and quote material in your source would be necessary to write an argument, but it's also essential in your own arguments. You would not want, to quote the entire Declaration, or the entire, because it's quite long. Okay, so in a case like this example, you would want to summarize and paraphrase and so forth. Now, summarizing is important as well as you're putting your papers together. Summarizing involves shortening original passages and putting in your own words, and that's what you should do. It gives the gist of the passage, includes its important points while leaving out major details, okay? You have to imagine yourself as the author of the piece. You are summarizing and be true to the ideas that the author is expressing, even when those ideas conflict with your own personal points of view. Then you move from beginning a careful read to the writer in your own words and sort of then you're moving smoothly from being the careful reader, to thinking about recreating the other's thoughts. This is to let our readers, or why? Well, the why here is to let you know that you are, let our boss know about the basics of what we have been doing, or to tell our friend why he or she should not see a movie. Okay, when you summarize this, why would we do this? Well, it's got a lot of this, this is why you would summarize, okay? You're just giving a summation, and you want to be careful. You should analyze your essay to compare and contrast how novels, central to the work, or how your ability to carefully comprehend and recreate those ideas, okay? For example, what are some of the ideas that you would summarize about, liberty, about Jefferson versus Lincoln? There are two different summaries here, and they both would be different because each one was written at a completely different time, okay? Paraphrasing involves sort of restating the content in your own words, okay? It's different than summarizing. Paraphrasing is roughly about the same length as the passage it paraphrases, instead of a condensed of a longer passage, okay? And sometimes, when you're paraphrasing, you're putting it in your own words, and you'll use paraphrasing when you want to capture the idea, but there is nothing about the wording that makes repeating it necessary. In other words, what you'll want to do is, when you want to capture that notion, that those ideas, but you don't want to paraphrasing involves a little more than, when the idea can be made clearer, I guess, by rephrasing it would be better, okay? So when the idea is clearer, something about the wording makes it, repeating it, necessary, you don't. So in other words, you're going to want to paraphrase when you want to recapture the idea, but the wording is such that you want to making it repeating is necessary. In other words, it's an emphatic. It's really important, okay? Whereas summarizing is shorter, paraphrasing isn't necessarily shorter. And when the idea can be made clearer by replacing it, or when the style is different from your own, okay? So summarizing is a little different. Paraphrasing is, whereas summarizing involves shortening a passage, putting it in your own words, making things, but making sure that you capture the gist of the idea. Paraphrasing isn't necessarily shortening it, okay? It is involving restating content, but only if it's really necessary. When the idea can be made clearer by replacing it, or when the style is different from your own, it's still keeping that in the air. Both ideas are important, but neither of them was worded in such a unique way as a direct quote was needed. Therefore, a paraphrase is sort of a logical choice, and in this case, the writer correctly documents and paraphrases things using the MLA format. And the same thing when you would be summarizing as well. Because you're using the same ideas, you would certainly, even though you would talk about somebody's ideas, you would certainly continue to cite that person's ideas instead of talking about the ideas of Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. You wouldn't use the whole thing, but you could certainly summarize it, and a summary would be much shorter, whereas a paraphrase would be more of a point-by-point clearing up, and it's roughly the same length. So a summary of the Declaration of Independence would be very shorter, whereas a paraphrase wouldn't necessarily be shorter. It would be more of an explanation of and rephrasing to make it clearer. I know it sounds strange, but again, both would still involve quoting. Well, here's an example. Randolph Warren, a victim of formaldehyde disaster himself and founder of the executive director of the Formaldehyde Victims Association of Canada, reports that it is estimated that between 10,000 and 12,000 deformed babies were born to mothers who took formaldehyde. Okay, so this is an example of how you might do that. And this might be in a case where you would, use the MLA format. You're talking about Randolph Warren. Page 40 is the page that this would be on if you were looking at quoting something himself from a citation. Now, there's no single sentence on page 40 of the Warren article that both provides the estimate of the number and effective and identifies what has done, but what you've done is you summarized what was on, or paraphrased what was on that gist of it, okay? And you're still getting that idea. Both the ideas were important, but neither of them was worded in such a unique way that, that a direct quote was needed. So, the logical choice here is what you did is you would have, let's say, you talked about the victim himself, and you talked about the estimates in this long report that he gave, but you gave just enough information that came from that document. Rather than writing the whole document down, you gave just enough of it, but you still cited that same document, Randolph Warren, on page 40. We would know from your citation that it would be important enough, and then you correctly documented the paraphrase. Quoting is really easy. Quoting a passage and phrases from a source, if they express the ideas and words more effectively than your own. You only quote directly when their ideas are better. In reading a source, you may come across a statement that is really, really good, and so you would want to quote that to support your point because it states that. If the author of the statement is a professional in his or her field with a great deal of authority, it would be appropriate to quote them rather than paraphrase them, okay? If you were writing a paper and mentioning the ideas of some philosopher, you would not want to, say, look at the second treatise on government by Locke and, directly use those words. You might want to paraphrase those ideas or even summarize them to make them clearer for your audience as you have interpreted them. But it would still be those person's ideas. So, of course, you cite them. It's important that you want to establish a source's authority, okay? Most common way is to use the person's name, their position, and then, of course, the correct MLA citation using author's name and page number at the end of the sentence. Boom, there you go. And that's always there. Your writing will always have more power if you establish the authority of each author from whose work you're quoting or paraphrasing or summarizing, okay? This is important because, this is where you're showing you're getting those ideas from those source. And, you would say a famous philosopher, you would say something along the lines, John Locke, in his second treatise on government, stated such and such. and you would cite that, paraphrase it, even bring in that person's paraphrase what he said, and then cite it. Okay, now, maybe somebody else will disagree with that, but the fact that you cited that person's ideas, then that shows that you're establishing that person's authority, and their affiliation, of course, will go. That's already established. But the fact that they wrote this is important. Now, the reason for bringing all this in, it's very short, because what we're talking about is as you're writing your claims, okay, what you're writing are your reasons, your claims, your points, and then as you write them, you are backing them up with what you're doing. And so it becomes important to use sources, and it becomes important to back up what you're talking about with other parts of authority, either through paraphrasing or quoting, or through summarizing. Summarizing is shorter than paraphrasing. A summary is, if I were to say write a summary, I would say write a summary of the Declaration of Independence. It would be, you would write a paragraph. That's what you should do. And then, of course, you would cite it if you were to cite it. Paraphrasing, that's different. Okay, it would be taking a piece that was written like the Declaration of Independence and developing. It would be about as long, but it would be using the more up-to-date language that you are using today, and explaining those points. It may not necessarily be shorter, okay? So, and of course, quoting is direct, I hope this has helped you guys. It may, if there's any questions, of course, please email me directly. Okay, thank you.